again, want to introduce mostly we need people who are like developers who really work with the platform. I think we're really glad to have somebody who really played with Ember.js, and so use this opportunity to ask as deep questions, technical questions you want to go in. I think I'm really glad that we have an investment here today. Please welcome him. Thank you.
Really nice. There we go. All right. So, well, like I said, my name is Justin. I'm here to talk to you about Ember.js. There we go. All right. So, Ember is an interesting topic for me. The reason I even know about Ember is because we acquired a company, Magic acquired a dating company that was based in California. And when we acquired them, all the employees that they had quit, right? So they had a single-page application framework that they had custom homegrown stuff in it, and nobody knew really kind of what was going on at that guy. So we kind of muddled along for a while and tried to get things to work and hack it together to get there, but it was eventually just slowing down development so much that we kind of considered just saying, all right, toss it all and let's start from scratch with building a new site. And we originally even started with Angular.js, right? And Angular.js is kind of the current hotness, right, in the environment. There's even a whole bunch of jobs here in Dallas that are targeting Angular. But Ember is kind of the new player to this space, and it's slowly gaining traction. I know at least that Twitter and LinkedIn are trying to at least hire people that know Ember.js skills. So it's kind of behooving to everyone to know multiple frameworks, right? You want Backbone, maybe you want Angular, you want Ember on top of that. So the more things that you know, kind of the better everything ends up being for your career. So what I'm going to talk to today is kind of introducing you to Ember.js and how to start working on it with your own application, maybe start testing out with it on your own time, because I'm pretty sure probably wherever you work isn't going to let you say, hey, let's rewrite something as Ember.js, right? That's just not feasible. So what is Ember.js? Specifically, it's a framework designed for ambitious web applications, specifically for single-page web apps. Now, they kind of emphasize that ambitious keyword because they're trying to produce a whole bunch of concepts and conventions for you when you use Ember that's applicable to making a large application, right? So you can totally use it for the smallest of applications, but it's also geared towards making large, scalable, maintainable applications for big websites, right? It capitalizes on the one major thing that made the web successful, right? So back in the 90s, whatever it was, right? The whole point was you could sit there and say, hey, here's some resource out there, a URL. I want you over there to take a look at this. I'll send it to you in an email or something like that, right? And your buddy can then take that and go look at that and see what he wants to see about it. The problem lots of times nowadays is that you have single-page apps that are keeping all their state information contained internal to the app, right? And so trying to share a URL maybe isn't as successful because they don't have the local storage that they have or internal memory state that they want. And so it can get this really inconsistent experience sometimes. Now, a lot of the new frameworks, they obviously solve that problem. But they tried to capitalize on making sure that the URL was shareable to everyone else. And it's also a combination of technologies and frameworks that solve common problems, right? So instead of rewriting a templating engine, we'll include one that already exists. Instead of rewriting promises and making our own implementation, we'll include a library that already exists, right? So we're going to gather together a bunch of things that work already, put them into one package, and then use that as one comprehensive solution, right? So it's important to note that Ember.js kind of works on conventions versus configuration. There's still some configuration that happens, right? But you're kind of making things named a certain way or putting things in a certain spot, right? And it automatically just kind of wire it up together when you actually go to run your application, which is a really nice feature because it doesn't have to you don't have to slow down to say, okay, make sure I'm assigning this onto some configuration object or including some variable somewhere or attaching to the scope parameter, for example, if you're using Angular, right? In particular for Ember, they use handlebars templating. And this is an existing library that kind of transitioned from like an old mustache library to handlebars, and now they've kind of extended handlebars a little bit more to add their own helpers on top of that, right? So compared to Angular.js, where you're doing declarative markup, right? You're not sitting there looking at your div tags and writing, say, an ng repeat or something of that sort in there. you have a slightly different way of doing it, it's going to look fairly similar, but it's obviously way different than saying, okay, this could probably run in a browser that didn't know anything about it, right? Handlebars, you have to compile it and then use it as a template, right? And then, in addition, the big probably difference between Ember.js and Angular, which is going to be a common theme probably today, is talking about how they deal in performance, right? So Angular, right, has a digest where you go through and scan through all the watched objects and then watch, and if there's any changes that have occurred, they update their templates, right? Ember has a slightly different approach where they have a bunch of queues behind the scenes. And so when you say I want to update something or you make a change, it puts a change notification in the queue, and so instead of having to watch everything, it just watches for change notifications from these queues and then runs the update, right? It's not going to probably be a big deal. You're talking, small amounts of performance, right? But if you're looking at a really huge application like Gmail or something like that, you probably get some speed savings on that. So, what is Ember really good for? The kind of the future, I think, of web development is moving towards the situation where you have an API that houses all of your business logic and rules and whatever, and then you have just various forms of presentation layers, right? So you can have a couple of native apps, right? And you might have a desktop web app, and then you might have a mobile web app, or you might even have a responsive web app that deals with both of them, right? So we kind of want to capitalize on that by making sure that our framework deals with that pattern very well. We're probably going to want to make JSON requests to go get data, or perhaps to do an active record pattern, which is push back and forth data between your server and client, right? We want something that makes it really easy to follow that format. So Ember is made up of a couple different components that you start with. And I'm kind of going over this a little bit ahead of time so that when we go look at code, you can say, oh, hey, I can recognize that concept and see how it's going along. You start obviously with the application itself. It's what bootstraps all the event handlers, watching for say maybe the hash change on the URL, for any other, it starts the event queues behind the scene and get your website ready to wire together all the component parts. In addition, there are routes, and routes are kind of the, I guess you said like endpoint handlers for where you're trying to go. Because again, we're looking at sharing URLs, right? So I want to say I'm going to /about. That's the shareable URL. Route is what's going to take that URL and translate that into actual data and logic and presentation. Then you have controllers, which end up functioning kind of like view models. So you can always take your business logic data, and so that's just going raw in a database maybe, or it's just some kind of server representation. Maybe that's not entirely consumable ready for the web, right? Controllers let you specify additional aliases on top of that, special presentation level logic or properties or data that you want, and then keep going without having to worry about a lot of translation logic. Views are a kind of an advanced section on Ember. You have, it's kind of when you really need to get really deep into the guts and you want to make something very custom happen. So in many ways, when you're looking at a JavaScript framework, you have a lot of code happening and going on, right? The whole point we're trying to get away from is having a document ready handler and then putting a bunch of click event handlers in there, manually registering up things, kind of in a very rigid way, because it's not very amenable to change on that point, and it's not very maintainable, because then you're just including script files left and right on things instead of trying to impose order on your scripts. Views are where you're normally going to do kind of custom logic, where you're like, okay, something is not handled out of the box. I need to know if something's going to scroll into the viewport, right? Maybe we don't have something that's directly available for that, but there's a jQuery plugin that does that. Well, in a view, that's where we kind of put almost right above the view template level logic to say, okay, I need to know about some events that just aren't handled normally with the framework. And so that's where we kind of do things like that. The templates themselves, those are the handlebar presentations that you've made, right? So that's where you're going to specify all your markup, and you're going to specify maybe some of the events, some of the other interesting things that'll happen, like for example in Angular where you're doing an ng repeat, right? That's the kind of stuff you're doing in the templates with the handlebars markup. Lastly, you have models, which are basically Ember representations of state, I guess you'd say. You don't actually have to use Ember models in any format. It just makes things kind of easier. You could use plain old JavaScript objects, right? And you could probably do pretty well for the most part. The models that they have are also including in some of the extra change tracking information. So if I change a property, it's a lot easier to notify everything that is changed and that we can continue to update state. And lastly, you have components. Components are reusable pieces of logic that you want to use all over the place. So say you have a Twitter like, or a tweet button, right, or a Facebook like button. You want to reuse that component on multiple pages without having to rewrite all that logic. Well, you can house that all in a component and then put that on different pages with different binding information. So, all right, so creating your first app, it's actually pretty simple. It just takes one line, and we call ember.application.create. There's obviously some more configuration options we can put in that, but for now, this gets you everything you want to know. It'll start the router. It'll start stitching together the views in your templates. If you're on a URL, right, it'll try to transition to the first route. And it sets up a couple of defaults for you that make life really easy. So even if we just do that, all right, everything's cool, we're ready to go. It also produces an application back to a variable, and that's kind of your namespace for the application. So normally the best practice many times is to say, okay, window.app equals application.create. So now it's kind of app as your namespace is available everywhere, and that's where you're going to attach things to. So you're going to write new prototypes or functions or whatever it is you want onto that namespace. It's not exactly synonymous like scope is in Angular.js. It's more like a known starting point so that Ember's framework can go looking for things, right? Go on. There is a fantastic Chrome plugin that they actually wrote that will visualize a lot of things that Ember does for you. And it's actually really great at debugging things if things aren't going exactly your way. There's a lot of defaults that also just suddenly magically appear as soon as you do this, right? So we can see we have an application route, a loading route, error route, and index route. And we haven't even done anything but write that one line of code. And you can see here I have route, controller, template, and the URL that it has, right? Some of these you don't see actually URLs on because they're not actually presentable to the user. They're kind of framework behind the scene things that are occurring, right? So when we start this up, create the application create, it's going to start up, render the application route, go to the index route because you're on just probably slash at this point, right? We're not doing any hashes at this stage, and it'll try to render what's in the index route. So when we make a handlebars template, we can specify them inline on the page. So, for example, we do a script with text X handlebars, and we name them, matching the names of the templates. So if we go back, right, we have the application template, the index template, error, loading. Those are the tokens that you see appearing in the data template name, right? So that way, Ember knows to wire these together and say, okay, you're on the index page, I'm using the index template, right? In addition to that, there's kind of a hierarchy on top of this, as you can even see with this last picture. You can see everything else is kind of indented more under the application area. And that's because you're also, in addition to having all these features there, there's a hierarchy of views. So the application template can be kind of thought of as like your header footer. It's your layout behind all your actual view presentation. So you're always going to get application no matter what you do, right? And then depending on your route, URL, hashtag, whatever you want, right? You're getting subchilds for these things, right? So if we render this in the browser with just this content here, you're going to see this is the index template. Now, the first thing that might look a little interesting on that is this outlet handlebars mustache looking thing, right? So you can make expressions in handlebars by using the double mustache bars. And outlet is a specific Ember implementation extension that says this is when you want to put child content in here, this is where you're going to do it, right? This is the outlet designed to receive that content. So now, the interesting thing about this too is that if you never supply a template name, like I can take the index template away, right? If I do that, the application is not going to crash. It's just going to display zero content, right? And that's because when you don't specify a template name, it's equivalent to just having outlet. So even if the index template is the root of everything and it just has an outlet, well, there's no content to stick in it, so it's just blank, right? So we can even get rid of the application template here and just have index, and we'll see the same result. All right, so now let's talk about producing some bindings. So one of the big features, obviously, is you don't want to be manually triggering updates for things. So if a key up event happens, you don't want it to go find another element, update its text, right? A lot of frameworks do this for you. The way we do this in Ember is we produce expressions inside of handlebars and then bind them to other helpers. Ember has exposed one called the input helper. what this does is it produces an HTML input tag, right? Here we go here. And produces and marks it with a couple things so that it knows what to do with tracking with it. And then we also bind it to the current value of token name. So if we look at this in a browser, I can start typing into the text box, and just as key up occurs, we're seeing the value for the token name, the value change. Now, the interesting thing about this too is if you see here in the inspector, what they've done is the handlebars template, when it compiles, it produces these metamorph tags, right? And these are basically the placeholders that Ember knows how to deal with to introduce content, right? So if we can have some really complicated content showing in there, or we can just have basically text going in there, or a couple other things, right? When you're doing a handlebars template like this, if you use double mustache, it's going to insert those metamorph tags. You need to do a triple mustache if you want to escape it and just have raw content, right? Because it's interesting, like if you try to put token name and say we're going to make that the alt tag for an image, right? It'll insert those script tags right in that alt string, and that's going to make it obviously not work very well, or look pretty nasty. So that's why you want to do triple mustache to escape that. All right, so let's take a look at a little bit more advanced bindings that we have in templates. One of them obviously is that templates have a context. So when you're executing a template, there is a model being provided to it. Now, in this situation so far, all we've done is create the application and create a couple templates, right? There's no actual models being supplied. Well, behind the scenes, if we go back to here, we can see that there is a controller being provided to all these guys. We haven't defined any of these, right? They're just being supplied as defaults. Ember will do that for you on your behalf if you don't actually override that in any functionality. So right now, the index controller probably is just a blank object with no properties and no values. So when we write out this, right, Ember has a inheritance chain on top of it, have a nice two-string representation. So it's really helpful when you're going through, maybe sometimes if you're debugging, you can try to console.log that. You can see if there's specific references, like if you have an array of things, you can see that, oh, hey, there's actually the same actual objects in an array of two strings, because they might be complicated pieces of data. But we can render that out in string, and it looks pretty neat. The next part are some other of the handlebars templating mechanisms. One of the extensions, obviously, is the each operator. And that's kind of your representation of doing a looping structure. Ember tries to implement a kind of a enumerable interface for a lot of things. So they kind of try to wrap arrays with an enumerable thing, so you can get like for each operators, or kind of get a state machine thing going in many ways. But it just even works with raw data, right? So in this situation, I've created another script tag here and just assigned app.colors, right? Now, that's nothing amazing. We're just assigning an array of values. But in the template itself, we can pull off of that data name, because we have context to everything, including the index controller, say window, right? I can pull off of that, loop over each one of those dudes, and create div tags for that. So comparatively to me, you know, your opinion may vary. I find this kind of superior to the Angular approach with declarative markup, because you can at least say, hey, at a visual glance, really quickly, there's something that's not standard that's going on here. Sometimes you can gloss over attributes on things, which can be slightly problematic. So that's kind of looping in a nutshell for the most part. You can provide a token name for it. You can actually omit the values, like value and app colors, right? So if your model itself was an array coming down, like index controller itself was wrapping some kind of array or enumerable of some sort, just using pound each with no variables whichever would enumerate over the current context model. In this situation, because you have either something that's not in the model or something in a different context, you provide a token name value and the actual source. Lastly, what we see here in this example is the link to helper. And one of the things you normally have to deal with when you're making a web application is, how do I link to other pages, right? How do I make sure that that's kind of maintainable in a way? So I can make raw anchor tags and do an href and point to a specific page. But if I change that name later, I have to now go find all the spots in my project that do that and rename those areas. It's a lot easier with some tooling I'll show you to show you how we can iterate over that with some tools and say, hey, that token no longer exists. We probably should blow an error on this. You need to go fix your stuff. What that's going to produce at the end as an anchor tag, obviously, and it's going to have the routing that you set up in your configuration for the about URL to go in there. Now, we haven't defined the about URL in these examples yet, so you haven't seen any of that at this point. But this looks pretty standard UI that's going on. So routing is the next thing that we want to go over. Since we didn't define any of it, we had an implicit route that was added, and that was index that we saw in the Ember inspector, right? So the format you use is this.route, obviously, because this callback to approuter.map has been context switched to point to the Ember application, right? So this dot is now in the context of the Ember application. We can assign any routes by giving a token name, in this case index, and you can optionally supply additional arguments. You don't have to do anything past the token name if you don't want to. That will tell you what the path is, right? If you don't specify the path, it just assumes that you're going to /token name, right, as the default. So it's kind of friendly in that regard. You don't need to do more than you need to. It'll set up defaults for you and work with the conventions that are present. So it's convenient in that respect to deal with extra routing, right? Now, Ember supports two different modes of sharing these routes. The default version you're going to get when you just come out of the box is going to be hashtag routing. So, for example, index will be pound slash, right? If you make an about route, it'll be pound/about, right? So that way when you're sharing a URL with somebody, it's pretty shareable, it's just text, there's no state information. The router will figure everything it needs to do when you open that URL to transit you to the appropriate route and views and templates down the road. But you also have the option of using the history API. And that has its own set of problems, just in the minimum that you need to make sure that whatever server you're using to host this content knows to point these raw URLs back to the same URL, to the same view file that's delivering all of your Ember content, right? Particularly me, I come from a .NET background, and so I like ASP.NET MVC a whole bunch. But that means usually if you're trying to do Ember on top of MVC, you need to supply a wildcard map to say, okay, anything that's not mapping, say one of my API endpoints needs to come back and point to this one page. So if you're using another framework, right, you just need to do the extra step of using the history API. Once you do that, you no longer have hashes. You just have /about, yourdomain.com/about, and Ember will figure everything out. All right. So now that we've defined an about route, we can look back in the Ember inspector and see that we have this new route about, right? And it's already declared the defaults that we figured out. It's going to choose the about template, it's going to give you an about controller, it's going to choose an about route. We haven't defined any of these yet, it just did it for us, right? And they just have 0 implementation details. But having single level areas is not enough, right? You're going to have a complex URL scheme somewhere in your site, right? And so we can also specify that by using the resource function. Now, resource, you can kind of think of your view structure being a tree in a way. Routes are effectively leaf nodes. They don't have any subchildren, right? Resources end up having children, and they kind of redefine the same kind of template and structures in your application. So when we define a resource email, right, you can see here we have the email route, and then email loading, error, inbox, and index route. And you notice we only supplied the inbox there. Well, it figured out, hey, you didn't put an index route in there. We're going to stuff that in there for you anyways. It's a default when we do this. That can slightly catch some people off guard if you weren't aware of it happening, right? But now that you understand the conventions behind supplying defaults for everything, you don't necessarily have to worry about it as much, as long as you're targeting the right things, right? And so you can see here, when you're looking at the inspector, you can see what the URL is going to be. It's going to be /email loading, /email/inbox, right? And that's just basically because we're using the hashtag version, so we have #. So when we're looking at the Ember inspector, you can see how it goes from left to right in the same format. You will execute the route first, and it will do any kind of business logic you need, and then take the model you're passing back and wrap that in a controller. And so that has its own level of indirection and hooks that you can use to work on. And then once you're on top of that, you go down to a view in case you need just the last level of control, and then you're binding to the actual template itself and handlebars. And then conveniently, when you're going back up the chain, say you have a click event that's going to occur, it's going to go back up to try to hit the view first, but is there anything on the view that's going to handle this? No? All right, back up to the controller, back up to the route, And then if you, even on top of that, maybe try the application route, the last step, and then, okay, boom, we might throw an error that we don't have anything to actually handle this event that has occurred. So when we look at it, we're kind of rendering templates, kind of a old hash, I guess you'd say. Just headers, and you keep going down as you go down the tree to your children route. They just keep getting wrapped by templates higher in the set. All right, so let's try deep diving into some code here. All right. So here we have our application template.
Maybe on split screen.
Oh, okay. Probably would do. There we go. That's better. All right. So just to show an example here. Right. Cool. So when we're looking at this, just inserted it straight up inline because we just did text. We didn't include divs or spans or anything, right? It's not really putting a whole lot of markup around your stuff. The only thing that happens most of the time is that you get these divs with the class Ember.view. And that's kind of a default wrapper, again, going with the Ember default strategy of putting something around your content so it knows exactly where, internally, when it's using jQuery or something of that sort to go target your content. So now, let's say, define some more scripts.
Excuse me. Could you make the font bigger?
Sure. Let's see here.
Kind of blind back here.
Better?
Yes, thank
Bigger?
you.
All right. Sorry. So let's make. Okay. Right. Refresh the page. Now when I go. So, right? And so we haven't defined an about template at all. It just said, cool, we're down with it. We're just going to insert that outlet tag. So you have footer content and the header content and nothing else. And it's nice because we can go, do that correctly. You can go back, use the forward and back buttons to translate back and forth between states in your application, and everything will be recreated appropriately because you can actually left the page and Ember knows in the memory model what's going on. But if you send that URL to somebody else, it'll pull together the content it needs and present it on the page. Now, I haven't shown anything really kind of what happens when you have routes or controllers. So let's specify something real quick. Let's go app.about route. Just Ember.route. Stick. Right? So that's effectively what the framework has created for us already when we didn't do anything. But the most common hook that you're probably going to extend is the model hook. Right? Now this is what's called when you actually invoke the route. So you're going to say, hey, get me the data I need to render the page, if any. Right? So I can sit there and say, hey, and return 1, 2, and 3. Right? Text. Okay, fine. Yes, incredibly powerful. All right, now assuming I've done everything correctly, you should see a fine page display. There we go. Right. So we're not doing anything extremely groundbreaking yet. We're just putting content on the page, right? But the interesting part here is we can also translate and produce additional things on there, right? So let's say we have span that says this token does not exist. It'll automatically create these variables for us and produce a binding. Right? So cool, we've done the demonstration now of using a JavaScript framework to automatically update the UI. Woo! Right? So but the power on Ember, right, is not just saying, okay, here's data presented on the page. We can do transformations. So let's do the about controller. Now there's two actual controller types you can inherit from. We have array controller and object controller. And you can probably guess that they're used for different scenarios. You're going to want to use an array controller if you know you're going to be returning back a piece of enumerable data. Otherwise, you're going to use object controller, because array controller has a couple more semantic things like trying to set up the set of elements. And so if you just pass in an object, it's not going to freak out, but it may not work exactly the way you want it to. So in an array controller, I can now sit there and say, cool, let's call this another property, right? Yep, it's time. Cool. So now we've extended, say, the data we're getting back from the server and producing more value. But we have more. We can produce what's called a computed property. Now, computed properties are one of the interesting things in Ember that kind of give it a lot of value. So let's say I have first name, Bruce, last name, Aaron, right? Return stuff get. And I'll show you what happens when you don't do this correctly. So let's say we put a full name on here. It's not going to give you exactly what you want to see. In fact, it should produce the string representation, because you're like, oh, that's not giving me a whole lot of value. Ember has actually extended the function prototype that you can provide this dot property syntax on here. And what that does is it turns it into a computed property. So it now will function to your template like it actually is just a member is assigned to your object, except it's a cache value. It tries to go out and execute this value, cache the value it returns, and if any of those, if you have something that changes on the template, it'll automatically do an update. Now, property, let's just show this to make sure it's working. Cool, there you see Bruce Banner, right? But now what happens if something changes, right? This guy doesn't actually know it's going to be updated. Property can take an argument collection that is a series of expressions, binding expressions, that tell you, hey, I need to know when this guy needs to invalidate, right? So I can say, I need to know when it changes from first name or last name. If either of those guys change, I want you to recompute this property, right? And even if you change both at the same time, because Ember has that queue system in the background, you're not going to get two updates. It's just going to say, one, update that guy when you're finished doing your data manipulation, and then recompute the property, so you don't get excess computation that happens, right? So let's add in do some extra stuff here just to show what happens with the event. So we want to actually update that content. Alright, so what I've done here is produce a button, and I have an Ember extension here that produces an action for the default on button. And we're going to call this action update name. Ember is trying to do this basically by taking a raw event, a click, a Kia, or something of that sort, and produce a semantic event, because you want to view a update name event code. I don't want to use a click event code, right? So when we go to the controller here, or technically we'd go from the event, from the template to the view to the controller, but we don't really need a view at this point. We can produce this special property called actions, right? Update name. Let's just do a blur, make it easy. Cool. Now we can even also bubble that event, I think, by returning false on that guy, but most of the time you try to keep your events obviously located as close to the template as possible to prevent additional side effects from occurring. Most of the time you usually don't need to know click events happen up the chain, but it's totally doable if you want to say return false. I believe that will say it's not handled and it'll bubble up the chain. Now, that's not helping us much, it's just a click event, right? So let's say I want to say this.set first name bulk, right? So now when we call this value and update the first name property, our computed property knows to watch the other one for changes, and so we click the button, it automatically updates and presents the UI with the new updated template value behind it. So, you can do a lot of interesting things with findings in that way, and now you can target it exactly what you want. So you don't need to say, okay, watch for any changes to happen anywhere. I just want to know about these particular few couple of changes. In addition to that, we can also pass arguments to actions. So for example, I can pass 1. And the way they're doing that in Ember is they have kind of a regex pattern that's looking for this helper they've set up and matches any other arguments passed here. You can pass in a string literal, you can pass in an object. If you pass in an object, the default is to try to look for an ID property to send into the parameter collection. So when we go up to the action, here we have params, right? Param. We bet you case over his law does not strike. 1. See? So you can now pass around, say for example, if you have a big table of data that you're presenting and you want to do like updates kind of an Excel-like format, right? You can pass in specific context data if you want to your object, really pass to the parameter. Now let's take a look at another example. Let's make a new route of product. Let's do product detail. So right now we kind of have a static URL structure. That obviously doesn't work for 90% of people because they want to have dynamic content. They're either going to have a blog post with a custom URL name or something of that sort that says this is unique content you want to define, right? So what happens here is we can produce a path and say I want that to be product ID, and that's now produced a dynamic segment in Ember. So when you match on the route path, don't try to send the ID value into your model hook. So let's create path.route. assuming I've done this all correctly, we can go to product. Right? So now we see the link to our products. We can click on that guy. Fantastic. Let's just call that one. That's token. Murphy's Law always happens. Just make it really easier. Alright, there we go. So it's kind of easy to lose yourself a little bit when you're looking at template things, and that's why it's nice when Ember tells you something like that. It said, hey, you didn't actually create anything for this controller. It was a generated product controller for this route. So, you know, hey, that's an extension point that you may have missed that you may want to deal with, right? So now we can go back and forth, all these dudes, right? And you can see how the parameter is being passed correctly. Alright. Now let's look at, say, using a view. So when you have a view, that's when you're exposed to additional extension points to deal with content you want. So let's call this one the product view. Right? Now, they try to abstract it so that you have specific hooks to get into to deal with. Wait, hey, since this is a single page app, things are getting pulled in and out of the DOM by the framework. When you click on things, you're not technically in control of that, right? And so, in all of this, we're not writing any jQuery selectors to update elements or whatnot. But occasionally, you might need to do that. The hook we can use on views are did insert element and will destroy element. Right? So did insert element is called when we've decided to render the template, we're including whatever piece of component logic or view structure we have here in the page, and so we call this dude to get our logic presented or ready for insertion. And conveniently, Ember has kind of a mini form of jQuery included in it, and they can expose it in this format. I can say this dot like that, and that's now a shorthand way of referencing the current set of elements expressed by this template. So you're now kind of attached into the div that has Ember view class attached to it. So now I can say, okay, find all of the, what do they call this one? It's the point view. All right. Find all the everything. Now, obviously, you probably don't want to be doing a whole bunch of selector magic here, because it's kind of an anti-pattern with letting the framework deal with that. But at least personally, I've had the use case of saying, okay, I want to know when an element is inserted, and in particular, when it was scrolled into the view. So I wanted to say, provide a fade effect. You know, one of the requirements, yay, in the last project was provide a fade effect when it came into scrollable view. Right? And so you find a nice jQuery plugin called InView or something, and it tells you, hey, I now know when this element is in the viewport current dimensions. And it's sometimes kind of a slow thing because it's trying to have to recompute that on every scroll event where things are. And so you don't want to necessarily be putting a whole bunch of that stuff everywhere. So all I want to know when the element's actually on the page. And when it's not on the page, I want to take that event and start off. Right? So that's where I put it in here and say, cool, find my element, attach the InView event for my custom jQuery plugin, and then deal with that event. And then when you're going to remove this, then we're going to transition to a different route. We don't even have this list of things that we're scrolling into view anymore. I want to unattach that and make sure we're not losing any memory. This is kind of like a advanced point here where you don't really need to deal with views a whole bunch. In fact, the Ember people try to discourage you from using reviews in many places just because it tends to muddle up your code, and you'll have a lot of bad patterns being introduced into your solution, right? So, assuming I did that correct, let's run this guy. Right? So here we see we applied it to our div, and it just happens to naturally be that way. All right, so that's kind of a basic setup for how to get data pumped through your application. You can provide UI elements. You can kind of get actions to associate values with your application. So I guess you'd say that's most of what happens for most people right now. They say that they're going for an ambitious web application. This is clearly not everything you need to do, right? One of the common use cases that you're going to have with a large application is you're going to go to your API and request it for data, right? So give me back all the products in category 3, right? You're going to do an API request off of that, get back a JSON response, and you want to consume that in your code. Well, if we go back to the Ember inspector here, we can see that we have these loading routes in here. And this is something that's pretty nice out of the box that helps you with that pattern. If you provide a promise-looking object as the result of your model hook, the Ember application will actually block resolving your route until it resolves that promise and then continues moving on. And while it's in that loading state, it'll actually present a loading template. So common use cases, you want to put a loading spinner on your page. We're waiting for the AJAX request to come through, right? So we can actually produce a template. Let's call this one Kendall. Right? That is there. And now let's go implement our about route, or index route, sorry. They ship with a library called RSVP that produces their promises, but you can totally use jQuery's version of it with the deferred. It's as long as whatever object you're returning has a then member on it that is a function, it assumes it's a promise and will try to react to that accordingly. So let's just create a promise here. And if you've never used a promise before, we'll make the assumption that everyone's done that. A promise is effectively a representation of a future state. So because threading is not exact, you don't really have multiple threads on JavaScript for the most part. You're single threaded until things are going in and out of their time slice, or not time slice, but out of running. You can't really have multi-threaded things going on. The browser can have some stuff in the background that'll eventually fire an event and try to put a new event in there to deal with that. But deferred is the way, or promises are the way of dealing with asynchronous code that, to simplify dealing with asynchronous code so you don't have a giant indent statement. Because it's really easy in jQuery, for example, to do AJAX call, and then your success callback, you have another call, and you keep indenting farther down the page, and it's really hard to view. Deferred is a nice solution to that, because now you can have a chainable set of, chainable API in a way to deal with all these asynchronous operations. So for example, I can refer to return deferred that promise, right? And that's actually doing that. But nothing's actually occurred with our deferred yet. We have two options. We can either resolve the future value or we can reject finding the future value. So in this situation, to simulate having an API, we'll just have a set timeout, right? And we'll call that one for 3 seconds. And then we'll do deferred.resolve. And say we'll just pass 10. We can pass, whatever object we want to, and it'll get chained through. So while that's running, we'll be displaying the loading graphic. Right? So it's a convenient hook that you can do that they just give you out of the box that makes that scenario a lot easier. In addition, we have an error route. So if something blows up spectacularly, you can implement the error template and say, hey, we didn't get the server response that you want. Here's something. Maybe try refreshing. We'll give you a button, or maybe we'll even try to do a refresh timer or something of that sort, right? You still kind of have this this hierarchy and life cycle of doing the Ember request to get the data that you want. Now, in addition to all these fancy things, right? We can, where are they going? We can talk kind of about the functionality, I should say, around, let's show you a resource. Yeah, let's call this one transformers. Right? So we produce these values here. Now, what happens in the life cycle is we get a request into, say, pound or slash transformer slash Megatron, right? We're going to hit the application route first. It's got its own model hook, so we can return the model back to the application template, which is where it's convenient to say, have your sign-in data, you're logged in, this is some kind of user context. And then we'll hit the transformers route, and it has its own model hook that we can use to return data specifically just for the transformers section. And then we'll hit, say, the Megatron route, which is where you load up data specifically to Megatron and display it on the page. You have this hierarchy of route data that you go through and then get your actual result. But from your child's up, they can access up the hierarchy for data the other ones have produced already, so you don't need to recalculate that state. If you did a JSON, if we did an AJAX request in the application template, it would throw up the loading, get the data, and then go to the next route. That one can have an AJAX request. It'll be loading for its particular subchild, go to the next route. So it can block in parallel or in a sequence serial down the chain from the hierarchy. And then from the bottom one, we don't want to go and re-execute that AJAX request. We've already got the data. So let's make a app.transformers route. Okay, so now I've got that guy, and let's go with the Transformers Megatron route. You can see that I'm not doing anything particular to wire that up, because it's just by convention. We know that Megatron is a child route of Transformers. So the name that we create is based on convention of how it works in the hierarchy. Because for most part, we've just been doing top-level views here. But you can keep chaining these together, and so go infinitely deep as you want, and then just keep attaching to the app name, right? So now we have the Transformers Megatron route. And then we can sit there and go, okay, var parent results. This dot controller transformers. So let's do these guys here. Show off an example of the enumerable support that Ember has. We can wrap a native JavaScript array with a Ember array, which exposes, kind of the enumerable support we want, and also gives it some additional computed properties. One of these computed properties is first object, and it's nice when we have kind of the mix and support Ember. You can produce the actual values you want, and say sort them, and the sorted array the computed properties are there without touching the original data. So all Ember numerals support this first object and the last object computed property. So if the object data changes, it automatically recomputes. So let's go to the and you notice the convention there is slightly different because that's going to match what the Ember template say.
There's a trailing parenthesis on line 89.
89. Aha. There we go. Thank you, sir. Yeah, it's happening. Really? Fantastic. Transforms vector, right? Alright. That is kind of tough. Well, I'm not going to deal with that right now. We're going to move on.
There's 2 errors in the console.
2 errors in the console. Wow. Look at that. So yeah, that seems like a pretty good reason why they're doing it. Alright, I'll come back to that later. Alright, so let's go back to some of the property sets we can go with. So now we have an array controller. Let's go back to the about model and about graph. So many of these things. So we're returning back this array of data. Well, in the about controller, actually let's return some objects here. Showcase. Right. Okay, so we're going to return back a couple objects here. And now we can make a new computed property, and there's some additional syntax that we can expose based on these arrays. So let's call this, count. Right. Well, if we call this now and we put this in template, it should render out 3. And just to avoid having the same kind of thing, just make that work. But it's all fine for now. Too much stuff. Out of control. Ember. Well, let's not dwell on that too much, I guess, right now. So, the last thing I wanted to show you real quick today, just before, since this is kind of all going wheels off, putting all of this in the index HTML is quickly getting unmaintainable, as you can see, right? That's a horrible idea. What we can do, though, is just get rid of all this, right? We want to put these in separate files. So a structure I normally like using, for example, is put this in scripts. I can put the index, controllers I want in their own little files. I can put application index routes in their own deals, right? I usually have a startup file, which is where I define my apps and define the routing that's going on. And then I also supply individual templates for these dudes. Well, how do we actually include these on the page when these templates are in different .hps files? And that's where we include Grunt. Grunt is the JavaScript task runner, and this kind of increases the productivity when you're developing. So you can, Grunt, what it does is you can specify a set of tasks to perform, and there it is. You can specify a couple of tasks, and when you run this in the command line, it'll do certain things. Now this is all powered off of Node.js, so you need to install that and then download Grunt. In particular, there's one package that is incredibly helpful for Ember development, and that's Grunt Ember Templates. What this does is that when we run Grunt, right, it'll compile those application, those handlebar templates into JavaScript. So we're now no longer just doing the inline and at runtime computation of these templates. We're actually including them straight up in a JavaScript file. So let me take a look at the compiled JS. Here we can see how the application template, the index template, have been converted into actual JavaScript. So we get the full runtime, as much runtime performance as we can possibly get. And it also helps when you're developing. So let's go back to the index. HTML. So I'm going to comment these dudes. Cool. All right, so here we see all of our new content. In addition, when we're looking at the console, you can see Ember.templates, right? So we can see we've actually had an application and an index template defined. So a lot of times, when you're looking for something, oh hey, maybe I didn't actually name it the right thing. Maybe I had a typo when I named the file, because that can happen a whole bunch when you're working on a really frenzied development path. You can sit there and say, oh hey, that's why Ember is not actually working correctly, it's because I don't have that thing named correctly. So. Last thing up there, though, is that when we're doing all this Ember development here, let's take a look at one of these guys. There's some helper functions that Ember provides that are quick, easy to get around for making some of those computer properties work. So, for example, in the new website that I made here, that I did leave ahead of time to fix all these fancy presentation errors, when we click this button, it's going to increase the count on current count. So we're just doing an increment action off of the template to set count, just put a count +1. So every time it happens, go click the different mouse is crazy, right? And then since we have this computed property, we're saying when count gets greater than 3, we're going to flip this is visible flag. So sorry about that. Go to the index template. There's a token here that I haven't explained to you, and that's the if condition. And we can send in a truthy condition there, expression, and if it's true, it'll evaluate and display the content that's contained within, right? So, for example, Boolean properties are very good situations for this. If you have some complex data, it's a really convenient way to make a computed property that will evaluate that truthy condition, like is visible. And so when we're looking at the index controller, right? Is visible as a computed greater than property. We're going to hit up one more count, and boom, now we got our image back in there, right? Nothing's crazy that's happened. So when you're looking at doing Ember development, it's really handy to have this Ember console here that shows you your view tree, routes, anything that might be happening that's going on in the performance, right? And then Grunt to compile your templates together and stitch together your application so it's all not in one big major file. So that's kind of the initial intro to Ember.js in a nutshell. There's obviously a lot more advanced stuff that happens. There's some documentation that's sometimes is a little weird. The expressions that you can use in your computed properties, sometimes not documented very well. However, there's a very helpful community on Stack Overflow that can help solve issues that you're having with, say, routes, other extension points, because there's, even in addition to model, there's like a before model hook, an after model hook, a setup controller. So before you even go to instantiate your controller, you can set values on that. There's things we didn't even talk about today, including dependency injection and some other advanced concepts, right? But that's kind of enough, I think, to get you going on Ember for the most part, so you can play around with it when you're at home, maybe at work with some small sample applications or internal stuff. And that's give or take it. At this point, I'm like, okay, we can open up to some questions, see if anybody had some things, because I kind of went through the breakneck pace and spoke probably way too fast for most people to follow. So, you guys have any questions? I'd love to hear them. What's up?
Is there a way to have a hierarchy of templates as well if you want to have multiple handlebar templates within one view?
Yes, actually. You should be able to make, say, a template, and you can use, let's find a template. You can include, you render options, include template name,
Okay.
right? And that sub-template will have the same context as your parent at this point. It just assumes that context. The more advanced one is components, because they have kind of a special event binding syntax to go back and forth. Because they try to limit interactivity between the parent context and the component context. But that's totally how you would do it.
And can you pass in parameters?
You can say we have a model. You can pass in a sub-model just for that one template.
Okay. And the other question is, it seems like all your HTML is in mustache templates. What if you have static HTML? You can throw those in mustache templates?
You mean, so you're talking like just raw content?
Yeah, that may not be dynamic at all.
Yeah, I mean, all you really have to do probably is just rename it as a HTML. I'm not sure actually how much it supports just not doing handlebars templates at all, because it kind of has the implicit understanding that you're doing this for binding syntax reasons. I haven't played with that for the most part. It may be possible. I would assume it's probably just easier at that point just to rename it .hbs and you're on your way.
When you're using Angular, a lot of times you'll either yourself or find a third-party library that kind of will angularize a certain thing, like FlexSlider or something. Is there a similar interface for Ember to do something like that?
Yes, there are a lot of extension points. In particular, when you're using dependency injection and whatnot, there's another project that Ember is actually working called Ember.js. And I don't think it's out of beta at this point yet, maybe not. But it tries to impose like an active record style format for data. So instead of you having to write, deferred queries yourself, you're just going off to your data store and saying, get me post by ID1. And it's just knowing how to inject into your Ember stuff all you want. In addition, there's other ways of injecting in handlebars helpers and extension points there. So if you want to have a special flavor of select box, right? You have a custom UI and the default select container isn't going to work, right? You could probably find a plugin that would just know to insert into the Ember functionality, hey, there's this view that we can stick in, and you just use it as a handlebar helper in your template. Anything else? Cool. Well, I want to thank Matrix for coming out here, and Mike and the HTML5 user group for requesting me to speak or inviting me to speak.
And then, do you have like a GitHub where you have some code?
Where I put this code up here? No, I can probably get something up and send it to the organizers, for example, if you want to play around with some of this. But yeah, I can do that, for sure.
Okay.
Sorry. I had a question about the routes.
Okay.
Once you call, app.routes or what have you, if you were to like load up another subchild or something or controller, would that be able to modify the routes?
There is some extensibility that you can reopen certain things. I'm not sure. I've never actually tried to add more routes dynamically after the fact. It may be possible. If you can keep around the context for the dude, sure, you could add a route. Like when you get the context of this in the application, you could probably add a route, no problem, just keep around that variable. I don't know if there's a generic extension point for that. So. All right, any other questions? Cool, well thanks for coming, guys.
We have more people come in, but we're glad that you're here. And if you don't know about Matrix, we specialize in staffing services and professional services. So we offer agile consulting and enterprise support, telecom, And then we also obviously staff. So if you know anyone who's looking for a job, or if you're looking for a job, make sure to grab a card. We would love to speak with you. But thanks for coming, and hope you enjoyed.
Again, is everybody ready? I just want to introduce, Kendall Scott is going to actually do a response to images. Before she starts her presentation, I just want to let you guys know the format and how we operate in this group. So this group is a free group. We are very fortunate to have Matrix sponsoring this group. The good news is, as of this particular meetup, we have actually reached 1,000 members. It's I think a big milestone. We're like more than 1,000 members right now. And so the format, we want everybody in the community local to Dallas to be able to come here and present. So we have an opportunity. We start at 6:30. We would like to start, and then if anybody wants to do they can't do a long presentation more than an hour. But if you want to just come and do a short presentation, please feel free. You can do the presentation from 6:30 to 6:45, and then 6:45 to 7. And then 7 to 8:30 is when we do actually the main presentation. But you're always welcome to do even the main presentation. I'm just saying, you can probably use this as a test bed, or you want to get introduced. Obviously, the topic should be related to HTML and HTML5 Node.js or something in the web platform. And this group is equally owned by everybody, so feel free. If you guys need to reach out to the organizers, or you want to participate more or volunteer more in the group, everybody is welcome. Okay, so welcome, Kendall.
Hi. So I was looking at, first I'm Kendall, and I've been working with and learning web development for the last year. And I saw a talk the other day by rewrote. He did this talk about a year ago, and it's called No Pixels, No Problems. And he covers kind of the need for optimization of images, and then he goes over some techniques. And he does a really high-level overview in that talk, but it is a year old, so it's almost dated in the web technology. But one of his points is that images are really heavy. And if you look at httparchive.org, it has this up for this month, and it's 64% of the weight of the web is from images. And part of the problem is with responsive web design, browsers are really greedy, and they go and they grab all of the images. So even if you're on a mobile phone, it's going to grab desktop-size images. If you're just using kind of the standard CSS media queries, there's different options to handle that. The one that I researched was called Cloud Technique by Estelle Weil. And this uses a object tag, and then inline you put data attribute with SVG tag, and then media queries. So it's a little convoluted, but it works, except for IE 8 or Android 0.3 or below. So it doesn't use a library, it uses only one HTTP request. It doesn't use JavaScript, and if you use JavaScript, that will slow down the image. The browser will slow down the image, and it doesn't rely on a third party. And it utilizes raster images, which is a lot of people are there's something called a VBox attribute that I haven't figured out how to work with in a way that's good yet. And then you have to escape characters. If you look at that's with it, the characters escape. It's kind of just a giant jumble. And changing image size can be a little counterintuitive. So I have an example here. And I didn't escape the characters because it made it too ugly to look at. So I was just like, well. So it doesn't work in IE if you try to pull up the site that I have. So if you look down here, you'll see that this is the image. There's the get. And if you slowly open, and it does this on occasion, it won't pull one. I went ahead and did 5. So I want to look crazy with the number of images I did. Oh no, can't open it the rest of the way. So you kind of see that it populated the rest of those after I opened the screen. And so it's just good for like saving your bandwidth. I mean, really, it's saving bandwidth for a mobile user. While on a desktop, it's not as big of a deal, but it does handle that problem.
Which request are we looking at on the network?
Oh, these 3.
Okay.
So I mean, it doesn't. Could everybody see it? Log that get. Okay. It doesn't pull the get request until you resize it. And it doesn't really, because it's embedded, it's kind of messy. There it is. You can't easily change anything in this. Like with jQuery, you can access it. You have to access like the objects, attribute. This is the way it is. And then there's some weird things with sizing. So if you're gonna size it, you actually have to put, I think it's background size. It doesn't really work as well with percentages because of the VBox. It's just, the VBox is saying, I want this portion of the screen. So the VBox takes in like 4 numbers. The first 2 are X and Y coordinates, and the next 2 are just like a width, it's like a ratio. And it takes up a portion of the image. So what I did was I just got rid of it, and then I rely on SVG to be picking up the object size instead of defining it. But I've heard that's somewhat dangerous. So I was trying to find a way to dynamically set up. I haven't figured it out because there's some problems as far as just I can't go into jQuery and say, okay, change this attribute because it's inside of this embedded tag. So that's the hard part about it. But it does work. So it does for like a fixed pixel size. You can use it now and implement it, and it will prevent the browser from downloading the desktop on a mobile site. It does solve that problem. It's just not as clean of a resize. Oh, and one fun thing that I found I like is you can put a background image, and then that loads on the GET request as well. It's like if you randomly want to hide cat pictures in your UX, it's possible to do that without